So how many of you have eaten or used palm oil today? Wow, you know. Okay, how many people don't know if they've eaten or used palm oil today? So it looks about 50% don't know and 50% have, which is about right. So oil palm products, including palm kernel oil and palm oil, are used in many soaps in the United States, as well as many food products. And the increase in use of palm oil has generated a huge controversy, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today, particularly the deforestation and carbon emissions from this booming palm oil industry. So palm oil is derived from the African oil palm fruit, and this tree, actually, the palm tree, is native to Western Africa. And traditionally, it's been harvested from the forest or from people's home gardens, boiled, and then pounded into a paste from which people can extract the palm oil. And so this is what pure palm oil looks like. It's a very dark red color. It's high in beta-carotene, and it's used to cook a lot of delicious foods. It's been traded for hundreds of years, perhaps thousands of years. It was found in the tombs of Egypt. And so it's part of people's livelihoods in Africa. And it's also part of our livelihoods, but in a very different form. So the palm oil products that we consume today are generated from a highly industrialized process. So this is an example of Sumatran oil palm mill in the 1920s. And the oil palm was introduced into Southeast Asia in the early 1900s. And it was developed into these plantations by the Dutch and by the British. And since that time, it has expanded fairly rapidly, about 25-fold, so that today we produce 250 million tons of palm oil each year. And there's been a particular growth in palm oil production since the early 1990s. So this is what a palm oil plantation looks like today. It's a quite different than what you can imagine would occur in the forests of West Africa. It's monotypic. There's nothing else that grows there. There's some snakes and some rats, and that's about it. Some people occasionally. And so it's harvested every 2 weeks, and it's actually, this is the fruit of the oil palm. It occurs in these fresh fruit bunches, which contain about 3,000 little fruits. And it's harvested, it's brought into trucks to a mill on the plantation, and then it's essentially autoclaved. So they use steam, high temperature steam cooking to soften the pulp of the palm fruit. So the fruit is actually made up of this mesocarp, the oily pulp, and then there's a hard shell, and then there's the kernel. So we get the red oil from the pulp and other palm products from the kernel. So palm kernel oil is derived from the kernel. And what we eat as a cooking oil is mostly from the pulp of this palm seed. And this is what crude palm oil looks like. It's very smelly, and it looks nothing like what we actually consume as an end product. After it's processed on the mill, the crude palm oil is exported to places like Malaysia, where it's further processed into the end products that we see today on the market. And these are some of the end products that we might consume here in the United States. So there's, as I said, the palm kernels generate soaps and beauty products. There's biodiesel, although biodiesel only comprises less than about 5% of the palm oil market. So it's actually a fallacy to say that demand for biofuels is driving oil palm expansion. It's really demand for food that is driving oil palm expansion. And we find it in everything from Girl Scout cookies. The palm kernel oil has been substituted for trans fats in the United States recently as we've switched away from trans fats. So you find it in things like margarine, packaged goods, and of course the oil, which we don't consume very much here in the United States, but throughout India, China, and Southeast Asia, it's the primary cooking oil in those regions. So we love oil palm. Oil palm is a high-yielding tropical perennial crop. And this is some propaganda from the Malaysian Palm Oil Council from a few years ago. And there is a basis in what they're saying. We conserve the world's land resources by producing palm oil. And So if we look at the yields of oil palm compared to other major oil seeds, so soybean, rapeseed, or canola, peanuts, and olive oil, oil palm actually has, this is the number of kilocalories that we get per hectare per year in 2010 from oil palm. Oil palm produces about 7 or 8 times the amount of calories per hectare as the next leading oil, which is soybean, which is really incredible. It's a very productive tree. So the hectares harvested of oil palm is quite a lot less than some of our other leading oils. So compared to soybean, which is our leader at 103 million hectares, oil palm only occupies about 16 million hectares around the globe today. And if you multiply these two things together, we get the total kilocalorie production of palm oil, which is about 1,230 trillion kilocalories per year, which makes it the leading calorie producer of any of our oil seeds, which is very impressive. And as you can see here, it's produced on a very small area of land. So this is great. This is, by some, it's been by some called the miracle fruit, or the miracle seed. However, there is significant controversy, as you all know, surrounding palm oil as well. So these two pictures are actually from the Twin Cities area. This is at Cargill, this is at General Mills. And this is the Rainforest Action Network protesting against these companies for either producing or buying palm oil. And this is Nestle, of course. And Greenpeace has run a campaign against Nestle and the destruction of rainforests and the killing of orangutans. So, and there's also truth in these campaigns, because oil palm is clearing forests, or we believe that it is, and it's causing biodiversity loss, and it is emitting carbon dioxide. So there's a problem. And I think it's the Marvel comics where they say there's, with great power comes great responsibility, and I think that that oil palm is sort of one of these situations where there is a great benefit of this plant to the globe, but we have to be very careful about how we use it. So I'm going to talk about today the work that we've done to figure out what are the effects of oil palm expansion on ecosystems, and then how might we mitigate the negative consequences of oil palm expansion on ecosystems and on people. So oil palm is mainly produced from Indonesia and Malaysia. You can see of total global production, Indonesia over here produces about 44%, Malaysia's at about 39%, and the rest of the countries in the globe produce less than 5% of palm oil. So this is the hotspot of palm oil production. And of course, this tree, because it evolved in Western Africa, it needs high light, and it needs relatively high temperatures, but most importantly, it needs high rainfall and consistent rainfall throughout the year. So it grows best in the tropical humid regions. These tropical humid regions also happen to contain large stocks of carbon and high biodiversity contained within tropical rainforests. And of course, Indonesia itself has about it has the third largest expanse of tropical remaining rainforests in the world. So the coincidence of oil palm and tropical rainforests generates a problem. The second issue is that there's actually quite extensive peatlands in these areas where oil palm is being developed. And so peat, it's organic soils that have developed over thousands to millions of years, and they contain up to 10 meters of organic carbon stocks of essentially partly decomposed trees and roots and leaves and things like that. And when peatlands are drained or burned for agriculture, they begin to emit carbon. And so draining or clearing these peatlands for oil palm is also going to contribute to carbon emissions. But the big question is, what is oil palm clearing? It could be clearing not peatlands. It could be expanding into areas that are not forested. And as of about 3 to 4 years ago, we really didn't know. There was no definitive research on the land sources for oil palm plantations. And so that's what I set out to do in my PhD, along with my advisor, Lisa Curran, who's at Stanford University. And so what we did, we focused in Kalimantan, which is the Indonesian portion of the island of Borneo. And Kalimantan is a great place to study these things because It's essentially right now the hotspot of oil palm expansion. Oil palm is expanding most rapidly in Kalimantan, and it has quite a lot of forest still. It has orangutans, it has the charismatic megafauna, and it also has extensive peatlands. About 15% of the area of Kalimantan is covered in peat. And in order to figure out what oil palm is clearing, we needed to know what the land uses are in the region, as well as what the carbon stocks in those land uses are. So this is an example of kind of the heterogeneous landscapes that we work in. And you can see in the back, there's intact forest that has been extensively logged, especially in the 1990s, which of course reduces your carbon stock. So we needed to detect logged forest areas. This is an oil palm plantation right here, recently cleared. I think this photo was taken in 2007, so that area had been cleared the prior year in 2006. And then in the foreground, this is characteristic of much of Kalimantan. It's a swidden or shifting agricultural system, and it consists of rice fallows, new rice gardens, and then older rice fallows, which might contain rubber or durian or other relatively high carbon stock land uses that are used for agroforestry. And these lands are owned by the people that live in these regions. So you can imagine there will be some land conflicts, which we'll talk about in a bit as well. And so in order to classify these land uses, we downloaded a huge amount of Landsat data. Now Landsat, this is an example of a Landsat image, is a NASA satellite. It's been available since the 1970s. And what it tells us is, okay, we use these raw data, we do a bunch of processing on them, and combined with field work, so we actually go out to the field to make sure that what we're identifying from the Landsat imagery is actually what is occurring in the field. And we end up with a classified image, including intact forest, log forest, agroforest, non-forest, and oil palm plantations. And we did this for all of Borneo. And we did this in 1990 and in 2000, and then again in 2010. And this allows us, with this time series, to figure out, as oil palm expands, what kind of land use is it clearing. And the results were, they were pretty astounding, actually. So it turns out that right now, oil palm occupies about 10% of the island of Borneo. It's all in the lowlands. And this image, okay, this is Kalimantan. And we've got 1990 in the light blue, 1990 to 2000, and then 2000 to 2010. And that is oil palm that has been planted in those three eras. And you can see it's concentrated mostly in the coastal regions. So with these maps then, and with our land use maps, we were able to figure out what it is cleared in each of these eras. And so over the entire period, we find that oil palm is cleared mainly intact forest, about 50% intact forest, followed by log forest and agroforest, both about 22%, and about 10% non-forest. So these results show that, yes, definitively oil palm is clearing forest. The second thing that we were able to do is look at whether it's clearing peatlands. And again, the answer is yes. And in fact, in the past, it has cleared peatlands at approximately the rate you'd expect just by chance. So there's about 15% of oil palm located on peatlands right now. And then the third thing that we're able to do with these data are calculate the carbon emissions from these oil palm plantations. And what we find is that from 1990 to 2010, Kalimantan plantations alone, just the ones on this island, emitted 3 to 12% of Indonesia's CO2 equivalent emissions. And maybe that doesn't sound like very much. 3%, okay, maybe that's not very much. 12%, that's a tenth of Indonesia's emissions, and those include emissions from industry, from transportation sector, from all of the different sectors. So just from this one island and this one commodity, you get 10% of the nation's emissions. What's that? Oh, yeah, oil palm? Yeah. We think it's about 6%. Yeah. And this also, I should mention, doesn't include the contribution of indirect emissions from oil palm. So escaping fires from these plantations, logging. So the plantations often go and harvest timber before land clearing, which we can't account for because we can't attribute those emissions properly. And so there's and also land displacement. So if people are displaced, if their own agriculture is displaced and then they go clear forest somewhere else, that would also be an additional emission that we're not able to account for with this methodology. So then what we decided to do is to say, okay, well, this is the past. If we look into the future, what might be the future contribution of oil palm expansion to deforestation and emissions? And so we went to, with the help of a group of Indonesians, an Indonesian NGO, we went to a bunch of the provincial and district governments in Kalimantan, and we collected these leases. So what happens in Indonesia is that oil palm plantation companies, they don't actually own the land. They lease the land from the government for about 30 years, and those leases are renewed. So the governments have records of these leases, and then we can see kind of what is the future potential for expansion. And these leases, what we find is that between timber and oil palm, so timber's in yellow here, and oil palm is in red, about 54% of the island, or of Kalimantan, is covered by these leases. It's a huge area, with a 10% more in protected areas. And that 80% of those leases were undeveloped as of 2010. And this means, so we have essentially the potential to expand oil palm by, into the remainder of those leases, which of course will come with a cost to forests and to carbon once again. So we also project land use change into these leases, and we can estimate that by 2020, approximately the same amount of forest will be cleared in these leases as was in the previous era, with slightly less intact forest and slightly more logged and agroforest. So the picture certainly doesn't look any rosier for forests and for carbon in the future. We also find that peatlands actually are going to be cleared at a higher rate based on these lease areas in the future, at about 18% instead of 15%. And that by 2020, Kalimantan plantations could emit 8 to 38% of Indonesia's CO2 equivalent emissions. And that's a very large proportion of their emissions. And those are their projected emissions. So there are two things going on here. First is that Indonesia has actually promised that it will reduce its emissions by 26%. And so these kind of future expansion of oil palm could what do we say, could make this goal vulnerable. It would be difficult for Indonesia to reach this goal if oil palm expands by this amount. And just to put this in perspective, at the higher end, at the 38% end, these emissions are, in 2020, for Kalimantan oil palm, are approximately the same as Canada's emissions are today, the entire country of Canada. So they're not insubstantial at a global level. So after people see this presentation, they say, well, why don't we just expand oil palm into non-forested and non-peatlands? It seems like the simple and obvious solution to this problem. And from a carbon perspective and biodiversity perspective, that's absolutely true. However, from the perspective of the people that own the non-forested lands in Indonesia, this is not true. So there's, as I said, people own durian gardens, rice gardens, and rubber. Rubber is actually a really important product from this area. And people either have customary land tenure or they hold certificates from the government. And so if we start to think about shifting oil palm away from forested areas and onto non-forested lands, there will be major conflicts with people. And especially, this is not a type of agriculture that's done in your backyard. These are huge plantations and huge conglomerates. And each plantation is approximately the size of Manhattan. So it's not, it would be interesting if we could think about getting local people to actually do this agriculture, but right now that's not how oil palm works in Indonesia. So what can we do to solve this problem? What are the solutions besides expanding onto degraded lands that might help, both support food production and support production of this important global edible oil, as well as protect the resources that we're concerned about? And the first one that I think this is interesting is yield improvements. So could yield improvements in the oil palm industry lead to land sparing? And this group, Singh et al. In Nature 2013, argue yes. So they've come up. Oil palm's an interesting plant. It's a hybrid between Dura and Passifera, and you get Tenera. And Tenera is the very high-yielding variety. And Dura and Passifera are both low-yielding varieties. And when you cross them, Only 50% of their offspring are Tenera, of course, and 50% are the other two varieties. And previously, we couldn't figure out, prior to planting the oil palm and letting it actually bear fruit, they couldn't figure out which were Tenera and which were Dura and Piscifera. So they've developed a test now. So before they send these seedlings out to the plantations, companies can ensure that they're going to get the high-yielding Tenera instead of the lower-yielding Dura or Piscifera. So this will increase yields, and yield improvements could lead to land sparing, except for the fact that within the oilseeds market, and particularly the edible oils market, these oils are highly substitutable. So this means that if a consumer doesn't really care if they're buying soybean oil, palm oil, or rapeseed or canola oil, and so because of the substitution, if you make one of these oils more profitable, it will just expand. If it's cheaper to produce, it will take the place, it will replace some of these other oils. So that, coupled with population growth and dietary changes, essentially means that in the near term, the market for oil palm expansion is infinite, or it has a very high cap. So their yield improvements probably won't lead to land sparing within the regions where oil palm is grown. It could mean lands are taken out for other edible oils if those become less competitive. The second thing is international assistance. So Indonesia recently received about $1 billion from the government of Norway to put a moratorium on the allocation of new oil palm and timber leases. And this moratorium essentially says that the government can't expand its lease area any longer, which is a great idea. This actually does lead to protection of significant lands. But as you saw in our previous work, about 4% of Kalimantan is already leased to these companies, and this moratorium does not include those leases. So in the next 10 years, oil palm can continue expanding at the same rates that it is currently without much effect of this moratorium. In Papua, that's different. In Papua, there's significant forests. So this is the Papuan area of Indonesia, and this moratorium could actually have a great effect. So that's a positive. And the other great thing about this moratorium is that it's I guess we could say forcing Indonesia to refine its ability to map lands, to manage its databases about lands. And so there are definitely some positive side effects of this moratorium process. The third thing that I think is a very exciting potential, has a lot of potential, are these industry-led initiatives such as the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. And the RSPO, as it's known, was founded in the mid-2000s. And it provides certificates to companies that are able to meet a set of sustainability standards. And these standards include things such as not clearing riparian buffers. They also include financial sustainability and social relations with the people that live around these plantations. So this is great, actually. And the European Union has promised that by 2015, they will only source RSPO certified palm oil. The USA looks like it's heading in that direction as well. And this figure was produced by the RSPO, and they say that China and India are also showing positive momentum, which might be, I don't know if that's true. Maybe that's true. That would be great, because if we look at where oil palm is consumed, it turns out that China and India consume most of the palm oil. As well as the EU, consume most of the palm oil in the world. So if we really want to affect oil palm, what's happening on the farm, talking to China, India, and EU will be a game changer. So this is domestic consumption in 2009, produced by the FAO. And what China and India could do is, for example, set a tariff or an import tax so that certified palm oil is taxed at a lower rate than non-certified palm oil. And that could actually have a huge effect throughout the commodity chain. In the United States, unfortunately, we just don't consume very much, so we're not going to have much of an effect from our demand side policies. And the last thing I think to talk about is, so most and rightly so, most of the attention and money fixing this palm oil problem has been focused on Indonesia and on Malaysia because most of the crop is grown there. But there are plenty of countries in the world that could grow palm oil and that are actually expanding their palm oil industry, particularly Colombia, Peru, parts of Africa, even Myanmar and Cambodia. And those are places that don't have strong governance and land management policies in place. And so if those governments could put those policies in place before oil palm really expands, there could be some great benefits if there's proactive work in those places. So increasing governance in these tropical countries is a really important part of the picture. So I think, let's see, all right, that's it for me. And I guess I just want to end on a positive note, which is to say that this particular industry, I think, has suffered from a lack of innovation. And I think that there are many solutions out there that haven't been explored or thought of simply because the industry itself is making a huge amount of money and they have no incentive to change. And so if there can be a way to actually innovate and solve this palm oil problem and figure out a way to produce palm oil as well as conserve the natural resources that we find important, that would be, I think, an ideal solution instead of these polarized issues of it's great or it's terrible. And I think there's probably a middle ground there. So I'd love to hear from you guys on your thoughts on how to solve the palm oil problem. And I also want to thank my PhD advisor, Lisa Curran, as well as John Foley, my postdoc advisor, and finally Living Landscapes Indonesia, who's the Indonesian NGO that I work with most frequently. So thank you.